Thank you, Mr. General Evaluator. Let's begin the speaking program, shall we? Our first speaker is Mr. Bradley Beck, and Brad is doing a speech from Engaging Humor, Level 1, researching and presenting. It will be 8 to 10 minutes long. And Josh will be evaluating Brad. Do you have any personal goals from it?
Yes, he's working on body language and vocal variety. He even told me that maybe have his back turned towards us and be speaking away from us to let us know. So,
Okay.
Thank you, Josh. Brad's speech is entitled The Tonight Show. Talent alone won't make you a success. Neither will being in the right place at the right time, unless you're ready. The most important question is, are you ready? So said the great Johnny Carson, world champion of public speaking. Darren LaCroix says, stage time. Stage time, sage time, and stage time. Are you practicing, preparing, and presenting at every opportunity? When asked if he was ready, our next speaker, Bradley Beck, DTM, said, I was born ready to share with us his speech on The Tonight Show. Here's Bradley.
Dun, 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 da, 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 da. Remember that? If you're of age, you remember just about 11:30 after the local news, at least on the West Coast where I grew up, you heard that theme music and here we go. Johnny Carson would be ready to entertain us in the evening. I remember that very well because I was fortunate enough to be an intern at KNBC Los Angeles back in my college days. And somehow, some way, I got this job doing research for a program called At One with Keith Berwick, who happens to be an emeritus individual from the Aspen Institute, which is kind of funny because that's a left-leaning group now. But Keith Berwick was one of the most brilliant individuals I've ever met. He taught at Pepperdine. He was a Canadian, had a great accent, and I think it was much better than Charlie Rose. Well, stage time is an interesting term for this particular presentation because Darren LaCroix is a world champion of public speaking. If he is ever asked by somebody, how do you get better at humor? How do you engage with people? He will say, get the book. What's the book? The book is by Judy Carter, and it's actually called The Book, Stand Up, How to Do Stand-Up Routines. Why would you want to do stand-up? Well, Jeffrey Gitomer, my guru in business, says at the end of humor is the height of listening. People want to hear what's next. This book is a great resource because it helps individuals understand the techniques of timing, of attitude, of the rule of threes, all things that comedians use, but we can use as Toastmasters. We can practice these. It's stage time, stage time, stage time, as Darren LaCroix says. And he'll ask somebody, did you read the book? And if you haven't read the book, Darren will say, well, you're not serious. Go get the book. So I got the book and I've read it several times and it's excellent. So how does that relate to the Tonight Show? Well, back in 1978, let me get my little proof of, if I got it here somewhere. As I mentioned, I was an employee, temporary employee, but this was the golden ticket to get on the lot of KNBC Los Angeles. And back in those days, after my show was done taping, I would hang out on the Tonight Show set. I got to meet everybody from Johnny Carson to Ed McMahon to Doc Severinsen and all the employees. And I wanted to be in sound, audio. So I befriended the audience, all the guys who mix the sound in the stage and in the booth. Dave Williams was one of those guys. He was an engineer for the Beach Boys when they did Good Vibrations. So I learned a lot just from watching them. And comedy is interesting because when you see comedians like Rodney Dangerfield or Robin Williams or Jonathan Winters, and you get to see them live practice. And then you see them perform. It's an interesting process. And I learned from that and I've applied that over the years to my speaking. So does anybody remember the great Karnak? The skit when Johnny Carson would be the soothsayer from the East. Usually Ed McMahon would have a stack full of envelopes and he would hold them in his hands and say, plainly, a 4-year-old can see these envelopes have been hermetically sealed and been on the front porch in a mayonnaise jar since 4 o'clock. Only you, the great Karnak, can divine the question to the answer in your borderline mystical and divine ways. I will present now the first card. And Karnak would salam, salim, salami. And he'd pull up the card and put it to his forehead. And then he would say, what shouldn't you do when you are nicking your, I just screwed up that joke. And Carson would do that all the time. And the audience would laugh. But Ed McMahon would say, Nicaragua. And Johnny Carson or Karnak would say, Nicaragua. And then he'd open this up. And what shouldn't you do when you are shaving between your nagras? Bad joke. And everybody would moan, right? And then Johnny Carson or Karnak would say, no, may I praise furniture refinisher, stain your sister's hope chest. And everybody would moan and he'd go on to the next one. It was attitude, it was timing. It was constantly screwing up and trying to undig yourself from the hole. And Johnny Carson was the best at it. And I got to see that firsthand. One of the great memories I have of going to the Tonight Show was one time I had to go to the bathroom really bad after my show, and the Tonight Show was going to tape. And I wanted to get in there before the red lights were in, because once the red lights were on, you couldn't get on stage. I could, I knew the back ways, but you weren't supposed to open doors and stuff. So I ran in. I'm at the bathroom doing my business. And all of a sudden I hear voices come in to the bathroom and they're bantering back and forth. And I recognize this voice. It was the voice of Burt Reynolds. And on this side was Doc Severson. And there I am doing my business. And I started to laugh. And Burt Reynolds looks over and says, what you laughing at, bub? And I said, nobody's going to believe me that I'm whizzing next to you two guys. And Mr. Reynolds says, if you look over here, son, did you ever see Deliverance? You may never tell anybody. We all washed our hands. And then Burt Reynolds proceeded to tell the story of why there were dividers, according to him, against each urinal. Because the story goes, when John Wayne was working at the Old Republic Studios, he was doing his business, much like me, and a gentleman was standing next to him. And while they were doing their thing, he turned and said, you're John Wayne. And his pants were full.
Oh my
And
God.
the next day, there were dividers between each.
Wow.
I don't know if it's true or not. However, after that experience, I said to Mr. Reynolds, yeah, I gotta find it first. I got the wrong one. I must have fallen. No, it's not here. Anyways, I got his autograph. It was really kind of cool. So the next story I have is once I found out that we had a guest, Miss Lillian, Jimmy Carter's mother. And I thought, this is the closest I'll ever get to hanging out with the president's family. Although years later, I got to meet Mr. Trump before he was president. And so I thought, well, I'll go to the green room. That's where the food was. And if you're a college student, free food was everything. So I went to the green room and I had my pad and my pen ready to go in and ask Miss Lillian for autograph. And as I'm walking towards her, two of the biggest human beings I've ever seen were like two doors that shut. And I looked up and like Porky Pig, I was, what are you doing, son? I said, I want to get Miss Lillian's autograph. And they said, no, you're not. And Miss Lillian said, let the boy through. And this is the autograph. from Miss Lillian Carter, which was kind of cool. And I got a full plate of food, so I'll pass this around. It was kind of fun. Another time, I got the opportunity to know that Carl Sagan, the great astronomer, was going to be on the Tonight Show. So I just finished reading his book, The Cosmic Connection. Great book about extraterrestrials. And from a scientist, this was earth-shattering at the time. So I go into the hair and makeup where he's getting ready for the show. And I said, Mr. Sagan, can I get you to autograph this? And he was kind enough to do it. So I pass that along. And just then, Johnny Carson came in the doorway and I couldn't get out of there. So here it is, Carl Sagan, the king of the cosmos, Johnny Carson, the king of late night, the hairdresser, and me. And the only thing that really pissed me off was I didn't have a cell phone. They didn't have cell phones back then. But I got to hear a conversation, a kind of a pre-show conversation between these two guys, and I was just enthralled. It was amazing. Later on, I saw Mr. Carson. Actually, I brought along this bluegrass album to him. Because the guy's name is Fiddlin' John Carson. So I went to his secretary, Drew, and I said, hey, I don't know if Mr. Carson's related, but if he wants to listen to it, I'll let him listen to it. So I dropped it off, think, I was naive. What the hell is he going to listen to this for, right? But I thought he may be related. It's kind of cool. And then a week later, I get a note, hey, come and get your album. And I did. And then this came in the mail from Johnny Carson. It's kind of a cherished memory. One time I see him pull in his little 360 Mercedes, powder blue. And his license plate said 360 GUI. I said, Mr. Carson, what does that mean? He smiled and said, 360 guy, all around guy. And I've stolen that for a lot of social media on my banner. I love that idea. It's incredible to have been in that environment where I got to work with and see and just observe those kinds of people who, some people idolize. But I learned humor by studying what they did and how they did it. And I found it fascinating how timing, attitude, and the rule of threes apply to so many of the jokes. I'll leave you with one of my favorites. I can find it. Props, here it is. Karnak again. Sis, boom, ba. Ed McMahon, sis, boom, ba. Not as good as Karnak. Fill out the envelope. Of course, Ed McMahon's over here laughing at Johnny Carson trying to do this. Describe the sound of a sheep when it explodes. Sis boom ba. Mr. Toastmaster.
Brad. Yeah, great speech with a lot of personal stories. Great dive into your personal interests, life experiences. A lot of Johnny Carson and stand-up comedy. Your first goal was your body language. It's really great because I think in Toastmasters or in any public speaking thought is tend to have these boxes of thought how it should be and how it's not supposed to be. And I think we forget at the end of the day, it's about engaging your audience and how you're persuading it. And you breaking some of those boxes that we tend to cling to. And that's a great way to remember that at the end of the day, it's about engaging. And actually led to your best moment is when you were turn your back and you were whizzing next to Burt Reynolds and Ed McMahon. And him asking you, have you seen Deliverance? That was great. You did good, pretty good job at this, but I think you could do it even better is when you make a joke or make something funny to do an extra pause, let people laugh, let people catch up. That's what you're saying. The great opportunity to pause. You gave a 10-minute speech. We gave you time for a 10-minute speech and you still went over. So just, I encourage you to practice and then time yourself and adjust. But I think this is another area where we can tend to get wrapped up in our Toastmaster orthodoxy. I think it's not a bad thing to from time to time to go over time if it's something you're really passionate about and you think it's really important. Beyond that, for vocal variety, best thing was whizzing to me. So that's it.
Evaluation. Had to sneak it in somehow. Our second speaker today was Arthur, and his evaluator was Roger Buswell. Roger, would you please come up and give Arthur's evaluation?